Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first day of the conference, Rembrandt Seen Through Jewish Eyes, which we are preparing on the preparation of the exhibition that will take place in the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow in October 2022. We are honored to work with such great curators as Gary Schwartz and Mirjam Notter. And my name is Leah Chechik. I'm presenting Jewish Museum here, and I'm just welcoming you here and to say a few instructions about the conference itself. We are in the Zoom webinar, so all our participants are presented above, but the listeners cannot turn on or phone or microphone or the video camera, but you can chat in our chat space or ask questions, which we will ask our panelists afterwards. We have today 3 speakers, and we have small discussion between all the panelists and participants of the conference. And then we will ask our questions from the chat and ask Q&A space. We have simultaneous translation, which will be translated, the English speakers will be translated into Russian, and on the last day we will translate Russian speakers to English. So if you want to hear English only, please tap on the globe icon on the bottom Zoom bar. It says translation, then select English. I think that's all about instructions and the organization of the conference, and I'm super honored to pass the word to Gary Schwartz, who will start our conference today. Thank you.
Well, Leah, I'd like to start by thanking you. It's been such a pleasure working with you. We started in September 2017 and very intensively through the years together with Mirjam. And it's really been inspiring to working with you, with all of your wonderfully competent, unfailing support and warmth. Now, my personal background for working on Rembrandt Seen Through Jewish Eyes goes back 66 years. When I finished my junior year in high school, I had been going to Hebrew day schools, yeshivas, for 10 years by then. It seems I was not a very obedient student, because otherwise it couldn't be explained that the principal, Rabbi Lyman, called my mother in the last year of my studies there to say that he was afraid I wasn't going to make it through my final year of high school without being expelled. My mother was a very resourceful woman, and she managed to get me into an early admissions program at New York University, NYU. In my freshman year, I took Fine Arts 101, the introductory course in art history, and the teacher in the second semester was none other than Horst Janssen, the Janssen of the textbook that was published 6 years later, together with his wife, Dora Jane. And when speaking about Rembrandt, Janssen will have said something like the text in that book. Rembrandt, he would have said, had a special sympathy for the Jews as the heirs of the biblical past and as patient victims of persecution. They were often his models. Christ preaching, that's the etching on the left, like the Star of Kings, the drawing on the right, suggests some corner in the Amsterdam ghetto and surely incorporates observations of life from the drawings he habitually made. This was solace to the Jewish eyes through which I saw Rembrandt in my first academic encounter with him. What Janssen said smoothed my transition from a yeshiva bocher to a fine arts major, and later to becoming a Rembrandt specialist. Only after I was settled in that position did Janssen's assured statement begin to crumble. There was no ghetto in Amsterdam. Figures Rembrandt supposedly sketched in the street turn up in suspiciously numerous drawings. And did Rembrandt, in a period when all Christians repudiated Judaism, really have special sympathy with the Jews? The basis for Janssen's picture of things was already well-founded before the very first catalog of Rembrandt's paintings was published in 1836. In the index of John Smith's Catalogue Raisonné of the paintings, a special section was reserved for 28 portraits of Jews and rabbis, a specialty that was not seen in the work of any other old master. 100 years later, in Abraham Bradius's catalog of 1935, this number had risen to 37. As you can see from these random pages from Bradius, where one old man is called a Jew and another like him just an old man, the criteria by which models or sitters were called Jews were largely arbitrary. The evidence mounted that Rembrandt did not often use old Jews as models, and that his attitude toward Judaism was just as disapproving as that held by other Dutch Christians. In various writings starting in 1984, I broached this view of things, bringing me into still unresolved conflict with some colleagues. It was a bit painful, but to me, this view of things has greater historical likelihood than the idea of Rembrandt as a friend of the Jews, as a great exception in his time. It's always been a bit too good to be true. In 2006, I helped organize an exhibition in the Jewish Museum of Amsterdam, which labeled the ideas expressed by Janssen as a myth and sought to subvert them. One of the curators of that exhibition was Mirjam Knotter, who you will be meeting in a little while. When she was approached in 2017 to organize a Rembrandt exhibition for the newly founded Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center in Moscow, she brought me into the project, for which I became the main guest curator in close cooperation with Mirjam. The invitation from Moscow created an opportunity to do something different than what had already been done in Amsterdam in 2006. We also did not want to duplicate the outstanding exhibition held in the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme in Paris. These and other exhibitions will be discussed by the curator of that museum and exhibition, Laurence Sigal-Clark-Spald, on February 7th, 2 weeks from now. Departing from those models, we developed a different concept for the Moscow exhibition. Rather than an historical exposition, as in Paris, or polemical argumentation, as in Amsterdam, we wished to let Rembrandt's Jewish admirers speak for themselves without contradicting them. The material we found let itself be arranged in these 7 sections. The earlier ones had been worked on before, but to our knowledge, the study of the later groupings have not been thematized yet. The Jewish collectors, artists, and art historians with particular interest in Rembrandt were fascinating to find and examine. Few of them, it must be said, I have to emphasize this, few of them thought that their being Jewish had anything to do with their interest in Rembrandt. Some of the individuals we include had even converted to a Christian faith after having been born to Jewish parents. Yet, considering how in my own experience, in which the link between being Jewish and pursuing Rembrandt studies was purely coincidental, yet far-reaching in personal consequences, we do not let these other Jewish Rembrandt lovers off the hook. They're in our ambit. In the course of our research, Mirjam and I consulted the writings of colleagues who had written about these issues. We also approached them personally, asking them to join our board of advisors. We encountered nothing but enthusiasm and goodwill. We took further advantage of 10 of these colleagues by asking them to write essays in the volume of studies that is to accompany the exhibition and to present the kernel of what they have to say in the online format that you are presently enjoying. The text of their essays will be longer than what they can present in these talks. Consider them samplers to encourage you to read the book when it comes out in the fall with Amsterdam University Press. Choosing a keynote speaker for an online symposium on Rembrandt seen through Jewish eyes was, forgive the expression, a no-brainer. Who could we ask except the historian and art historian who has written major books on both Rembrandt and the Jews and is a star TV presenter? It could not please us more that Sir Simon Schama has agreed to speak and write an essay for our book. As a friend of Simon's for 45 years, I've made a dedicated attempt to keep up with his writing and broadcasting, and I have fallen short. But everything I have read and seen fills me with awe and admiration. The compliment paid to Rembrandt by his early supporter, the courtier Constantijn Huygens, fits Simon well. He brings universal truth to life by detailing specific cases with thrilling and moving with vividness. Rather than listing book titles, let me show you a photo of the unassorted and incomplete Schama shelf in my library. And books are not all he writes. Simon has commented on contemporary politics, culture, and cuisine in the best periodicals, and by yesterday's count, 174,363 followers on Twitter. In discussing with him which of the subjects in our theme would be most suitable for him to take on, we agreed that one phenomenon above all was the most appropriate because it came closest to his own background as a British Jew. That is, the British Jewish artists to whom Rembrandt had special meaning. These artists were one or two generations older than Simon, and were among the first he would have heard of as a child and whose work he would have seen early on. Dear Simon, the floor is yours.
Simon, you should turn on your microphone, please.
Did unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Apologies. It was very interesting. I unmuted myself, and the computer very sensibly decided to gag me immediately. But I've won that battle. Gary, thank you. Zoom won't allow anyone to see how much I'm blushing at your incredibly kind characterization, especially unworthy of being the object of something like Constantijn Huygens' eulogy for Rembrandt. But I want to thank you for asking me, and I want to thank you for your kindness and characteristic generosity in letting me speak about something yes, indeed, close to my own lived experience as a British Jew, and my interest in British Jewish artists who were a particular presence, as I want to try and argue, in the 20th century, and who responded to Rembrandt in a particularly powerful and resonant way. You don't, I think, have to subscribe to the full-on postmodernist nostrum of the death of the author to acknowledge that a writer or a painter's enduring mark on the world can live on independently from their actual precise historical intentions, always supposing it's possible, at any rate, to nail those down. And that it is really a poetic sum of what she or he meant to say or draw, plus how that intention gets refracted through the prism of readers or beholders that constitutes that essential afterlife. Rembrandt, like Van Gogh or Beethoven, lives on as much through resonance as historical actuality. But did he resonate with particular power for Jewish modernist painters who shared vocation, whatever their maniera was, seemed to be, in some instances, by definition, their modernism was a rejection of classicism, particularly of classical art education? Did they take him rightly or wrongly, mistakenly perhaps, as the epitome of anti-academicism? Or is that nothing more than the kind of idle romanticism which Gary has summed up from Janssen and others, either on their part or ours? However much Rembrandt may or may not have been an outsider, someone as likely to break the rules of art as observe them, as of course Jan Emmons argued, someone who began by constructing a persona, or rather shape-shifting protean personae, someone who understood that paint could be used theatrically to generate drama from how the paint landed and was handled on a surface, that its density could become a kind of surrogate for the reanimated flesh of the body, and who ended up marginalized by the indifferent guardians of orthodoxy as well as impoverished. However much that's true or untrue, history or myth, there's no doubt that that was the way he was seen and internalized by a succession of British modernists for whom, among other qualities, impasto ruled. There, now we've got, yes. Here is the last picture made in 1957 by the man who, in my view, is the greatest of all British artists in the first half of the 20th century, David Bomberg. The artist mantled, literally mantled in his work, the tools of his craft, palette, mahlstick, brushes in hand, painted with the utmost and loosest freedom, work unworked, you might say. Inevitably, the picture, at once stupendously beautiful, and even if one were not to know it, was the last cry of pain from a dying man, is also deeply unsettling and has been related by many people, including Richard Cork, who wrote a great monograph about Bomberg, to Rembrandt's Kenwood masterpiece, the famous self-portrait. Can we pull that up, Gary? Or yes, there we are. You all know. But of course, the differences are in the end much more telling than the affinities. However freely Rembrandt has painted his working tools and materials, especially, you'll all know the painting very well, I think, especially the almost indeterminate description of his hand, as well as the brushes. There's an irony, of course, in him actually holding the mahlstick used to apply finishing fine details to a painting. However freely his painting, his gaze and the head from which it springs is lynx-eyed, as tightly described, the face very tightly described, as the perfectly freehand drawn mysterious hemicycle, two hemicycles behind the master. Bomberg's face, we go back to that, Bomberg's head, Bomberg's mind, the seat of his phenomenal creativity, on the other hand, is in process of disintegration. Where Rembrandt's cap, itself a force of illusionist handling, is the epitome of the imaginatively disciplined hand, sits confidently and brilliantly on the head of the master. Bomberg, we can go back to that, has a monstrous, uncased representation of the brain divided into its lobes, the whole undifferentiated mass extruded from its protective skull. The anatomy subject of Dr. Damon, you might think, turned upright. And the vivid colors of his smock transferred to that extruded brain become sickly, the expression of irreversible disorder. But what did we, the next one? And the next one, thank you. What did this expressively rendered pathos have to do with being Jewish? The answer Bomberg gave, and he was for most of his life an irreligious Jew, though never an apologetic or defensive one, gives us the answer. This painting is one of a series of unsparing self-portraits, all done within 5 or 6 years of his death. And this one, and some of them, the greatest of all, are painted even closer to his end. This one, just a year before, and Bomberg himself ended his career in destitution, crushingly humiliating indifference by most of the British art world, depressed and physically terribly sick with lung disease. He titled this particular picture, "Hear, O Israel," leaving us in no doubt at all about his teshuvah, his strong return to what he conceived of as a religious Jewish tradition. But instead of a representation of the recital of the Shema twice daily, but also, of course, the prayer which will be much on the mind of a mortally sick man, has his figure draped in the talit, carrying the Torah on his shoulder. You could, I suppose, compare it with Rembrandt's almost quizzical self-portrait as St. Paul, which you all know in the Rijksmuseum. You can pop that up. But while the Bible is in the apostles' hands, Bomberg holds the Jewish Torah close to his body, penitently perhaps. If we can go back to the hero of Israel. I think it's on the next one. Thank you. Certainly not triumphantly. Either he's holding it in the manner, but not triumphantly, as it would be held in the manner of the Hagbah, of the procession around the synagogue. But the fall of light reflected from the Torah, saturating what we see as the right side of the body, puts me in mind, at any rate, of another redemptive near deathbed painting, one of Rembrandt's last and almost certainly unfinished, the Simeon in the Temple with the Christ Child in Stockholm. The light, can we bring that up? There we go, thank you. The light this time going the other way, from the looks of the baby savior, the infant savior, to the head of the old man whose unseeing eyes have been given back illumination. As he approached the oncoming darkness, Bomberg became obsessed with light, expressionist chiaroscuro turning spiritual. And the next Bomberg. His soliloquy, Noonday Sun, painted in Ronda, where he spent those last few years until he was so sick he had to be taken to a hospital in London, has this hot radiance strike the shoulder of his talit-mantled persona. Another painting with an explicitly Jewish description, the Talmudist, slices the head between dark and lit zones, as if in perpetual argument, like the disputing rabbis. It's said by those who want to see it that way that Bomberg has given himself a crown of thorns, puncturing the headgear of Orthodox Jews. And while I'm not particularly persuaded by that reading, the painting was, it's true, done in 1953, the year he was fired from his post as teacher at the Borough Polytechnic in Southwark, not least because he had defied all the conventions of academic art instruction. Bomberg's version of Talmudism then, not far from the mark, of course, was of perpetual and obstinate argument. He might have seen himself as a martyr to the importance of disputation. A reputation for obstinate argumentativeness was just one of the reasons the modernist art establishment in England held their noses when it came to Jewish artists, and especially David Bomberg. All the usual tropes of genteel anti-Semitism were at play in the wretched record of his repeated rejection. When in October 1939, Bomberg offered his services as an official war artist, writing that, quote, "the spiritual and cultural need that art alone can satisfy is greater now than in peacetime," Kenneth Clark, who presided over the War Artists Advisory Committee, we've got a nice photograph of, not entirely without self-admiration, photograph of Kenneth Clark, declined to take him up. Clark clearly felt that Bomberg was too showy, too histrionic, too gesturally pushy, too emotionally expressive. In other words, of course, much too Jewish, not at all in the English tradition, which Clark felt was needed to raise the morale of the country as far as artist work was concerned in the war. In a private letter, Clark wrote that Bomberg's work, like that, quote, of so many of his race, looks artificial and done for effect. If only, he sighed, it were possible to discourage Jews from painting. There never was any time during his entire 67 years of life when Bomberg was not conscious, acutely conscious of being Jewish. And that fact would always make him, by his own lights, something of an outsider. And that charcoal drawing you just saw, dating from the late 30s, keep this one up, Gary, thank you, may well remind you quite accurately of the kind of confrontational role-playing that Rembrandt was embraced during those first extraordinary kind of almost self-tronies that he made of himself on that tiny scale. Bomberg's parents were poor immigrants from Poland. His father's trade was the toxically unhealthy one of leatherworking. He grew up in Birmingham and then in the East End of London at a time when the influx of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe was matched by the rising tide of anti-immigrant political xenophobia, leading to the passage of the first restrictive British Immigration Act, the Aliens Act of 1905. 4 years later, still a teenager, he was 19 when he drew this self-portrait, again, may strike you as reminiscent of the kind of posing that Rembrandt liked to do in a mirror as a young man. Bomberg drew this self-portrait of the outsider artist, as I say, perhaps with something like the memory of those early Rembrandt self-imaging in mind, often taken, again, rightly or wrongly, by posterity as the face of Bohemian rebellion. I've just chosen an etching, the kind of thing that, yes, that wonderful etching that Bomberg may have had in mind. In Whitechapel, it was the Jewish Arts and Cultural Organization, along with the devoted belief of his mother, Rebecca, one Jewish mother who didn't want her son particularly to be a lawyer or a doctor, believed him as an artist, although she died early, that gave Bomberg the means, in company with other Jewish artists and poets like Mark Gertler and Isaac Rosenberg, to pursue his vocation. Maybe we'll go back to can we go back to the Bomberg drawing, Gary? Thank you, yeah. When Bomberg did win a precious scholarship to the Slade in 1911, he ran straight into the conservative academicism of Henry Tonks, who was a surgeon anatomist as well as an art teacher. Bomberg's conspicuous disaffection of the style of Tonks's teaching did not actually, and this says something well for Tonks, did not preclude Bomberg from winning a prize for drawing. And throughout his impasto-heavy career, Bomberg always remained an extremely rigorous and exacting, by his own lights, exacting draftsman. But there were moments, notably when he broke a pallet over the head of his tutor, Wilson Steer, when the Whitechapel boy, Bomberg, acted out his hostility to the orthodox conventions of art instruction. In 1913, he was expelled from the Slade for being a disruptive influence in and out of class. 40 plus years later, Bomberg's own art teaching at the Borough Polytechnic, where his students included Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff, both of course Jewish artists, would represent for him the pedagogic overthrow of much that Tonks had stood for. Bomberg, by contrast, would preach constant and would practice constant interaction with his students, encourage them to be mutually argumentative, technically liberated, and to put their minds to developing the force of particular artistic personality, all of which, of course, came from the kind of mythology of what artists of this generation saw as a Rembrandtian prototype of the independent integrity of the artists, their restiveness under the whip of formal academic training, particularly life drawing. Bomberg had no Huygens to act as his breakthrough patron, But for better or worse, and the next one, yeah, thank you. But for better or worse, he did have Wyndham Lewis, who saw in him the potential for a fellow vorticist, a promise that was too spectacularly for Lewis's liking, revealed in masterpieces like this extraordinary painting, The Mud Bath, where the clamberings of a Whitechapel Russian Schwitzbad were translated into these geometric forms as per the vorticist rubric. But instead of being bolted to an engineered design, much less a grid, these forms are always, for Bomberg, dynamically restless, animated, fidgety, mobile. Like Rembrandt, Bomberg was initially hailed for a brief time as the coming prodigy. He was included in an exhibition of 20th century art, partly organized by Wyndham Lewis, and actually given a one-man show at the Chenille Gallery in London in the summer of 1914, a terrible misfortune of timing, if ever there was one. But unlike Rembrandt, the acclaim did not last. Always restive, disliking accommodation to any kind of ism or deference, whether to the Bloomsburys like Roger Fry, who've become the showcaser of post-impressionist modernism, or to the dispensations, rather lordly, of Wyndham Lewis himself, Bomberg went his own way, and he paid a quite heavy price for it. Suspecting Lewis's sneering, and of course, actually, Wyndham Lewis would become an enthusiast of Italian fascism. Lewis and Bomberg nearly, in fact, I seem to remember they did actually came to physical blows. Bomberg was actually a devotee of Jewish physical self-defense. One of the things that went along with art instruction in evening classes in art were sessions in jiu-jitsu, which of course all the Jewish students of jiu-jitsu spelled Jewjitsu, naturally. Bomberg was very often, however, and this will remind you of something said about Rembrandt, was very often said to be on a hair trigger of extreme, sometimes physically violent grumpiness. After the First World War, and he'd served as a sapper and engineer and was so traumatized by what he saw in the First World War, actually shot himself in the foot to get out of it. This is not a career which was gentle or in any way without incident. He returned, albeit in startlingly different visual idioms, to Jewish subjects. First of all, the Ghetto Theater, which I think was in the early 1920s, if we can have that, grafting some of the disrupted planes, distorted perspective, and gloomy palette of the darker realms of German expressionism. One thinks of Otto Dix and Gross and Käthe Kollwitz. But then after 1923, an extraordinary counterintuitive return to topographical literalness in Palestine, and have a look at the next one, where he'd been hired by the Keren Hayesod to paint among as well as scenes from the Zionist settlements, edifying scenes from Chalutzik agrarianism. Bomberg also used the opportunity to paint very kind of what seemed to be kind of old-fashioned topographical views, very literally described topographical views. I think the next one is an example of that. There we go. That extraordinary kind of thing. You'll notice, however, with the kind of almost musical rhythm of the flat roofs, modernism creeping into what's otherwise a kind of very formally conservative kind of painting. Bomberg did, in fact, manage at least 2 watercolors of fruit pickers, and more to his own taste, since he'd come out of a world of labor, and particularly dock workers in the East End of London. He transferred that to doing a few drawings of dock workers, one presumes, in Haifa. For the most part, this is the kind of thing he did in the early 20s. But these landscapes and townscapes are largely empty of figures, and thus were curiously sort of disembodied. Eventually, the next one, as you'll see, in Rooftops of Jerusalem, his style evolved into exercise, much more interesting, I think, into architectural quasi-cubism, involving much flattening and patterning, sometimes as in this image of rooftops of Jerusalem, painted not long before he departed from Palestine, producing work of startling formal rhythm and beauty. Much good it did him. Abandoning his Palestine job, it was kind of mutually agreed, he wasn't suited for it. He certainly never really became anything like a wholehearted Zionist. Bomberg continued to have something of a reputation as a leaver, including an exit from his marriage, and artistically a loner. This reputation followed him, a very kind of unsocial kind of artist, followed him back to Britain. The 1930s, we can see a self-portrait from that period, the next one. Dramatic translation of the style of painting, as you can see. The 1930s saw him and his second wife, the artist Lillian Holt, living in Fordwich Road, NW2, very close as it happened to where I grew up, in northwest London. And this was sort of an area favored by a new generation of Jewish refugees as the 30s went on from Nazi Germany. A lot of konditorei, a lot of chess, a lot of chamber music, sometimes with all three going on the same premises. By this time in the 1930s, the so-called Whitechapel boys had scattered to the wind. Mark Gertler had de-Judaized himself enough to pass as native for the Bloomsburyites. Isaac Rosenberg, tragically, famously, of course, killed. Bomberg in the war. Bomberg, not unlike Rembrandt, in the 1650s, and about the same age, set about consciously refashioning his image. Like Rembrandt, too, in mid-career, he was handling his paint more densely, yet more freely, a kind of instinctively liberated, expressive impasto. Local passages of brilliance emerging from layered and slathered grounds. He was always, next one, dressing up, using personal props and wardrobe to role-playing, like this so-called man from Marrakesh. The tour de force of this transitional period was the wonderful seated, or you might say, since the next painting, he has a kind of cap which serves as a sort of crowned, enthroned self-portrait. This is from 1931, paint applied in Cézanne-like patches and tache, face lost in creative reflection, the deep shadows about the eyes, a modernized melancholia, work clothes turned into sovereign apparel. Unlike Rembrandt in 1658, the famous self-portrait in the Frick, there's a Freudian slip if ever there was one. Unlike the 1658 self-portrait in the Frick, Bomberg does not bother with eyeballing the beholder. He's off somewhere in his own head where he's appreciated, but wholly like Rembrandt at that moment, he's at a crossroads, aggressively aware of the disconnect between self-valuation and public esteem. I don't know, is the next one the Frick self-portrait? Rather hope it is. So, oh, no, it isn't. Okay, well, you all know that, and apologies for that. Rejected as an official war artist, Bomberg nonetheless paints what really ought to be remembered as the great icon of Blitz London. Indeed, you'll find it in the Historical Museum of London, if you can manage to get there. The badly damaged but miraculously standing St. Paul's at its heart, numinously lit through the filter of smoky late afternoon mist, the emblem of survival and salvation. Not altogether, I think, sort of unlike Rembrandt's spiritually lit windmill in Washington, if you will accept that it is, I don't know what Gary, the latest judgment about this, that it is in fact a Rembrandt. I've always thought it was. Can we have that? Yeah. Sort of the lighting and the sense, yes, of a kind of redemptive focus to the background. To get the Battle of Britain airborne angle of vision in his late afternoon, early evening image of London, Bomberg went back home to where he'd come from, to the East End, and climbed the tower of a church in Cheapside to make his study drawings. Like Rembrandt mythology, one can overdo the image of Bomberg as a loner, though he was never, ever in funds. An improbable job opportunity teaching drawing at the Bartlett School of Architecture. In fact, actually, Kate Aspinall has written a really wonderful article about the relationship between Bomberg's sense of his artistic vocation as much pedagogical or as painterly, or rather, Aspinall argues, the two are not in a relationship of mutual depletion, but mutual nourishment, which I think is actually quite right. And actually, he made, I believe, something like 300 applications for an art teacher up and down Britain before he got this short-term job at the Bartlett School of Architecture. That didn't last, but it was followed by something possibly more to his liking. That post I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, teaching evening classes at the Borough Polytechnic, and that managed somehow to keep the wolf from the door. Far from actually repudiating group identity, Bomberg encouraged it once he was in that position. And a number of his students, including Leslie Nahr and Dennis Crefeld, went on to form the Borough Group. After he lost that position in South London, can we have the next one? Which I hope is, yeah, and the next one, sorry. Yeah. After he lost the position, Bomberg retreated to Ronda in Andalusia, where he'd also lived for a while before the war, and where he developed this extraordinary, rich, theatrically gestural expressionism that was incredibly out of sync from the cool linearity of much of British post-war modernism, such as it was. When the 40s turned into the 50s, he was even more out of step with the beginnings of 1950s British pop art in the work of Richard Hamilton and Eduardo Paolozzi. Even then, though, his wish was to gather pupils around him in Spain, but only one came. You have one of the late self-portraits. His only deep subject became, once again, himself, viewed and painted. Can we have the next one? In this terrible, this is called vigilance, really. The vigilance turned brutally inwards in the terrible self-annihilating mode that characterizes that last series of self-portraits, and which drew him further and further into the interior recesses of what was becoming a specifically Jewish torment, as in Hero Israel. In the manner of another outsider, Van Gogh, perhaps, rather than Rembrandt, can we have the Hero Israel again? Thank you. The artist's death turned out to be the condition of Bomberg's belated recognition, even eventually his vindication. Although I wonder, and I actually simply don't know this, but I have a slightly pessimistic guess, I'm wondering how many of the temples of modern art, the Tretiakov, for example, Stedelijk, Pompidou, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, MoMA in New York, actually have a single Bomberg in their collections. In 1958, a bare year after he died, the Arts Council mounted a so-called memorial show. Even then, some of the belated compliments were grudgingly backhanded. He might have been our English Soutine, ran one such comment, if the passion of his handling did not so often override the subject. And the next one, we're going to switch to, this is an anti-Brexit moment. I'm not actually declaring Soutine an honorary Englishman, but I want to just stray over the channel just for a minute or two longer. But of course, Chaim Soutine was the very epitome of a painter for whom passion and subject treatment were functionally inseparable. And like Bomberg, rightly or wrongly, he took that working principle to be an explicit inheritance from Rembrandt, as well as other masters famous or notorious for the obstinacy of their personal maniera. Michelangelo above all, and Michelangelo, along with Rembrandt, was a kind of lodestar in the instruction that Bomberg gave in those evening classes in South London. In the 1920s, Soutine made 4 trips from Paris to Amsterdam expressly to commune in particular with the Jewish bride, not necessarily, I think, out of identification with the Jewishness of the subject, as much as the stupendous demonstration of the material drama of thick paint. According to his friend and fellow graduate of the Vilna Art Academy, Michel Kikoin, Soutine would be thrown into a state of trance-like distraction by total immersion in Rembrandt's late work, seeing in them a demonstration of heroic Promethean physicality. While the work of his close friend and fellow Jew Amedeo Modigliani described bodies through voluptuous line, Soutine eschewed that kind of draftsmanship for dense impasto, a sedimentation of paint that clotted, heaved, writhed, and pulsed with organically throbbing energy. What he saw in Rembrandt's Slaughtered Ox, which I think ought to be the next slide, was paradoxically, it's the next one. This is Soutine's version of it. I hope we've got the Rembrandt. Thank you, Gary. Sorry to be out of order. Was paradoxically, by Soutine's own light, something undead, or at least not altogether dead. Its viscera exposed, gleaming, slippery. The boy from Smilovici and Vilna was enough of a Jew to know all about the tradition of temple sacrifice, of penitential oblation, some of which he projected onto Rembrandt's quasi-crucified redemptive carcass. So if we can go on, I think I've repeated one of the Soutine, the next one, with any luck, otherwise we'll go back, thank you. Famously, when his own carcass, bought from a Paris butcher, dried out, began to stink and attracted great clouds of flies to his apartment studio, Soutine's long-suffering dealer, Leopold Wroblewski, helped him acquire regular pails of blood fresh from the abattoir, with which Soutine regularly bathed the carcass, refreshing its not quite dead sanguinary brightness. Painterly brilliance, even at its most lurid, thus became for Soutine the meat of art. When he painted, and the next one, there is the model, and the next one is Soutine again. When Soutine painted his own version of Rembrandt's Hendrikia, that's actually Kossoff. Can we have the next one, actually? I hope it, oh, okay. I'm sorry, we somehow, no, go back, Gary. That's again my fault, I've missed out Soutine's version. Some of you may know it, yeah. Soutine did a version of Hendrikia bathing in a stream. He used a peasant woman as a model, abandoning the liquid delicacy and loosely brushed erotic poetry of Rembrandt's original, going instead for maximum meatiness. Those of you who, if you go and find it, apologies for not being part of the slide, you'll see what I mean. And that engorged, rough-cast materiality put Soutine at odds with Paris-based modernism in the late 1920s and 30s, increasingly obsessed as it was with line, particularly, of course, in Picasso's case, the classical line and the printmaking, which signaled his periodic indifference to painting at all. Mondrian, for whom the ontological integrity of art was conditional on an uncompromising devotion to flatness, was nothing but line and plane, on which were hung skeins of dead flat color. This is Leon Kossoff's Woman Bathing in a Stream, and it has the same sense of being out of step with post-war avant-garde authority in Britain. And that sense of, whether almost certainly was actually gained from those sessions they spent as students of Bomberg in South London. And it was common to both Frank Auerbach as well as Leon Kossoff. Their upheavals in paint could scarcely be removed from the more formal, cerebrally mapped linearity of the abstractions of artists like Victor Passmore or the sculptor Naum Garbo. Those artists called themselves, quote, the School of London, meaning not just the place where they happened to work, but the bombed out, soot-darkened, smashed up houses and streets, constantly in states of demolition and reconstruction in the 1950s, which I remember very well from my own childhood. Here's one of Auerbach's building sites. I hope the next one, I think. Thank you. Their preoccupation with building. Can we go back to we lost the building site in Camden Town, was then translated into the mortuary build of impasto. And though their views of Mornington Crescent, Euston, Camden Town, and Paddington were gathered formally when they showed them under the heading of building sites, their real building site was, of course, the canvas. Likewise, taking their cue more directly from Rembrandt's candidly flesh-heavy nudes. Now we can go to that rather beautiful nude of Auerbach. Auerbach and Kossoff, and after them, their friend Lucian Freud, all pursued the ultimately delusory, I guess, but certainly unattainable end of an equivalence, even an interchangeability between flesh and paint. In headlong flight from his own skeletal linearity of the 1950s and 60s, early 60s, Lucian Freud would often insist he was not representing nude bodies. You have the next dramatic example of what he meant, so much as creating them in paint. We should have, can we have the next one? Which is a good example of what Lucian Freud meant. Characteristically, this was to award himself, Lucian Freud that is, godlike powers of creation, paint layers bulked up to match the heft of the sitters. But Freud's late and repeated return to painterly and etched, unsparing, almost obsessive self-inspection, and the next one, has often, next slide, thank you, has often been compared to, thank you, to Rembrandt's late self-portraits. The difference, of course, being that while the Dutch master's face crumples into poignantly doughy softness, Freud's, as was indeed the case, retained to the end the gaunt bone structure out of which his eagle eyes continued to stare. The extraordinary full-length nude reflection, you have the next one, which, what happened to the, we lost the reflection. There's a nude, okay, I don't know how we did that. Anyway, it's a dramatic nude self-portrait, which I thought was on the PowerPoint, of Lucian Freud standing in his studio. Can you just, is this the last slide, Gary? Oh boy, I don't know how we lost that. Okay, never mind. Yeah, I don't know how we lost that. Never mind. The extraordinary 1993 full-length nude reflection with its central focal point, the Freudian genitals, represented in a knotted clot of pigment, might, I suppose, be seen as unsparing an old pair of sandals protecting Freud's feet from floor splinters, were it not from the fact, and you'll notice this, or I think I may have been the first person to notice this, that the artist, despite the ostensible nakedness to which he subjects himself, actually renders himself as a makeover of the Apollo Belvedere, either a fine professional in-joke, or else, even by his standards, an act of defiant hubris. In the end, though, Rembrandt will get to you, chasten and move even the most ironclad of artistic egos, especially perhaps if you're Jewish. Taco Dibbits told the art newspaper that when Lucian Freud visited the Rijksmuseum a year before his death in 2010, Taco, suggested to the painter he might like to think of painting some version of Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. Lucian Freud famously did not care very much for other people's suggestions about what he might or might not paint, even should they be the director of the Rijksmuseum. But confronted with the masterpiece, according to Dibbits, Freud, who was also not famously lachrymose, came close to tears. And I think probably only Rembrandt could do that. Thank you.
Okay, next speaker, please.
Yes, please give the mic back to me to introduce her. Thank you. Wonderful, Simon. Thank you for introducing us.
Sorry about the missing slides, Gary. Yes.
No, I was looking for them. No, it was Leah who was doing the slides, actually.
Okay.
And
maybe she was shocked by, full frontal genital exposure, but probably not.
No, I looked at your last this afternoon at 4:00, and it wasn't on it there. So
it wasn't on it. Oh dear.
No.
Okay. Well, I guess that's a Freudian error on my part.
Aha. Okay. Well, maybe you can
Anyway,
bring it into the discussion session next week, because we're all going to be back again. Now, our next speaker, Mirjam Knotter, is, as I've told you, my partner in curating the Moscow exhibition and preparing the webinar. We've been collaborating on various projects for over 15 years concerning two artists we both love, Rembrandt and Charlotte Salomon. At the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, I have seen Mirjam rise to the rank of chief curator and exhibition manager. She has curated thoughtful and innovative exhibitions year after year. The biggest of her recent projects was a display of the complete 800-sheet masterpiece of Charlotte Salomon, Life or Theater, and a big exhibition on Kabbalah, which in different form was held at the Jewish Museum in Vienna and is now going to Moscow as well. For Rembrandt Seen Through Jewish Eyes, Mirjam worked together with a younger colleague, Guido Lechout, drawing on new archaeological and archival research into Rembrandt's neighborhood. And this is cutting-edge stuff. This evening, she will be presenting a summary version of their findings. Mirjam.
Yes, please tell me if the PowerPoint is visible.
Yes, but not the presentation. We see the whole PowerPoint.
Okay. So Leah, can you take over?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
1 second, just 1 second.
Yes, great. Thank you, Leah. In 1956, the Dutch author David de Jong published his Rembrandt voor der Schilders, Rembrandt, Prince of Painters, one of the most striking examples of fiction about Rembrandt and his alleged ties to Jewish neighbors. Going further than that, de Jong imagines how a Jew would have thought about the great master. For this, he created as his main character and narrator a man named Eli, a Jew, who became Rembrandt's model and friend. De Jong shaped his character and life story by combining ingredients from the life stories of various prominent members of the Amsterdam Jewish community. So he made Eli a man from a Jewish family of conversos, people of Jewish ancestry who forcibly lived as Catholics on the Iberian Peninsula. His father, in the story, fled to Amsterdam and embraced Judaism. There, Eli was raised as a Jew. He was taught Hebrew by Rabbi and teacher Jacob ben Jude Leon. And he studied Talmud with Chacham Zal Levi Mortera, Kabbalah with Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, at whose printer he also learned to engrave. And if that wasn't enough, he also studied healing and medicine, impressed by the knowledge of the great doctors in his community. Of course, was Dr. Ephraim Bueno his favorite. But, like a famous contemporary, the controversial philosopher Uriel da Costa, Eli had been wrestling with his new faith. He openly criticized practices within the Jewish congregation, which led to his being banned from the Portuguese Jewish community. Fortunately, he was able to do some work as a model for artists in the neighborhood and was spotted by Rembrandt. He not only became the artist's favorite model and friend, he even inspired Rembrandt to depict him several times as Christ. Next one, please. In popular fiction, can I have the next slide? In popular fiction about Rembrandt and his alleged ties with Jewish neighbors, de Jong takes the cake. He not only introduces all kinds of well-known names from Rembrandt's circles and community, he also assigns a role to women, children, and even domestic staff. Exemplary are the following passages in which Eli describes the circumstances around the death of Rembrandt's wife Saskia. I quote de Jong. Dr. Bueno suddenly appeared on the sidewalk. His face was serious. He put his fingers to his lips. "The lady van Uilenburg is very sick," he said. We stood in front of the sidewalk. The rumor of sick Saskia spread rapidly. The neighbors offered their services. I saw Yehuda Leon's wife arrive with a pot of soup, and the maid of Rabbi Manasseh with a tender chicken. A few weeks later, I replaced Bueno at Saskia's sickbed when the notary with the clerk presented himself. 5 days later, the lady van Uilenburg died at the age of 30. Many of the neighbors from the Breestraat also joined the procession. I walked next to Gerard van de Eekhout, who was crying, and Karel Fabricius walked alone. End quote. I've started my talk with this example to show how de Jong mingles facts and fantasy, creating scenes and settings in which Rembrandt's neighbors feature in the street and in their homes, with descriptions of interior furnishings and dress. Over the past year, this is exactly what I've been doing, together with my terrific intern Guido Leghout. We differ from de Jong in that we try to replace the factor of fantasy with archival and other sources. We found the reality to be just as vivid. By comparing historical maps with transfers of property and other sources, it was possible to reconstruct who Rembrandt's direct neighbors were and to connect this information to what we know about Jewish material culture in general. Of course, this is ongoing research and many treasures are still to be found. But let me take you on a stroll through the Breestraat in Rembrandt's time, with an occasional glimpse behind the doors. Before doing so, a few remarks are in order. Rembrandt returned to live in Amsterdam in the early 1630s after his previous stay as a pupil of history painter Pieter Lasman in 1625. The Breestraat was a fashionable street where many painters had settled, along with art dealers. Here also lived the kind of wealthy individuals, regents and merchants, who patronized artists. Residents from old Amsterdam families lived cheek by jowl with immigrants from abroad, giving the neighborhood diversity in status and religious background. During Rembrandt's years in the street, things changed. Some of the old elite moved to the new-built canals, while many Jewish immigrants settled in the neighborhood. From the third quarter of the century onward, the particular part of the street where Rembrandt lived became known as the Jodenbreestraat, call it Jewish Broadway. Upon his return from Leiden, Rembrandt first stayed, and you see the house here, with art dealer Hendrik Uilenburg, who ran an art business out of his home. His house lay on the corner of the Antony Sluis, a lock in the Amsterdam water system. At that time, the Protestant merchant Balthasar Visser lived with his family next door, in the later Rembrandt house. After Rembrandt's marriage in 1634 to Uilenburg's cousin Saskia, the couple initially stayed with Uilenburg, then moved to a succession of rented lodgings nearby. By 1639, Rembrandt felt that he had such a fame and future that he bought the stately house next door to where he had been living with Uilenburg, who had moved down the street. Next slide, please. Can I have the next? When Rembrandt and Saskia moved into their new home, their next-door neighbor was the then 39-year-old Portuguese Jewish merchant Salvador Rodrigues. Born in the Portuguese town of Bragança, we find him as a merchant in Rouen before he moved to Amsterdam. Rodrigues first lived on the other side of the lock before buying the house next to what was to become the Rembrandt house in 1633. After having lost his wife, he remarried in 1637 to the 20-year-old Rachel Aboab from Venice. Rodrigues had 2 daughters and probably 5 sons, who we know in later years as jewelry merchants, a trade that Rodrigues seems to have practiced as well. He was an active member of the Sephardic Jewish community, as a board member of the Jewish congregation and of the Etz Chaim seminary. In 1645, Rodrigues bought also the house next to his, apparently for his family to live in. His wife Rachel died in 1652, and when Rodriguez passed away 2 years later, an inventory was drawn up. This inventory, and I'm indebted to Jaap van der Veen for his help with the transcription, gives us a nice idea of the Rodriguez interior. We find curtains of red damask, yellow silk wallpaper, and among the furniture tables of walnut and oak. The then popular Spanish chairs of the kind that were also owned by Rembrandt, upholstered with red and blue cloth. We see also the reflection of international commerce, various Turkish tapestries, East Indian chests, and Chinese porcelain. And next to his house, a Bew Majolica plate was found, you see here on the slide, an Iberian item for which Dutch Sephardim had a predilection. Among the many other household items in the inventory are such clothing as a dress made of flowered silk and a black cape, which may have been Salvador's. On the wall hung a considerable number of paintings, many with gilded frames, including landscapes, a portrait of a woman and child, and even a painting with some naked images in it, as well as various biblical scenes and characters from apocryphal books, such as King Ahasuerus, the children of Israel, the Benjaminite bridal theft, the teachings of Jacob, King Balaam, the prophet Elijah, the woman of Sarepta, Tobiah, and a painting depicting the Temple of Solomon. Next one, please. Dutch Sephardim were active in acquiring art, as buyers at auctions, as commissioners of works by engravers and calligraphers from their own community, as well from non-Jewish artists and silversmiths. The walls of their homes were, not surprisingly, decorated with Old Testament history paintings by Dutch masters of the time. In their taste for subject matter, we see a slight preference for scenes with biblical heroes, such as Abraham, kings like David and Solomon, and the prophet Elijah, as you see in this circumcision scene in a Jewish family home. Also, the then popular depictions of the story of Queen Esther enjoyed their particular interest. As descendants of conversos and victims of continuing persecution by the Inquisition, Sephardim identified with the queen, who had to hide her Jewish identity, but who had the courage to come out to save her people. Further, as in non-Jewish households, their houses were decorated with genre pieces, quite a lot of portraits, landscapes, and quite often we see sets of small panels depicting the five senses, and also quite some maps. Scenes with nudes were not shunned. Not only Rodriguez' inventory contains a painting with nudes, an earlier fellow resident at the Breestraat, the Portuguese Jewish merchant Abraham Savati Pina, clearly had a preference for somewhat daring themes. Among the many paintings he bought from the estate of Cornelis van der Voort were a whorehouse, a piece of a naked woman and the vanity, Susanna and the elders, a courtesan, next to portraits of English and French royals, the Prince of Orange, and many throne faces. Back to Rodriguez. We did not find ritual objects as Shabbat and Hanukkah lamps or prayer books in his estate, as we do often in inventories of the houses of Sephardim. However, in the 1640 inventory of the Talmud Torah congregation, we find various ceremonial objects on loan from him, among them a silver lamp, a Torah scroll with silver holders, a green Torah mantle with golden stripes, and a white and gold Torah binder, and a pair of silver Torah finials. Finally, Rodriguez's estate contains a lot of jewelry, including an item described as a little silver boat in which 40 diamonds were set. Among this were also precious gifts that Salvador bequeathed to his daughters. To each of them, he left a small box with jewels with a note on which he wrote, The jewels in this little chest are for my daughter, which I give to her. God grant that she may enjoy them for long years. All of this wealth in the house itself stood in stark contrast to the previous situation in the basement of Rodriguez's second home, where a junk shop had been located. A scene worthy of a chapter in de Jong's book took place in 1634, when Rembrandt was still living with Eulenburg. the woman who rented the house, the widow of a Dutch sea captain, issued a complaint in the presence of witnesses against the woman to whom she rented her basement and ran the junk shop there. Her tenant, she said, causes great nuisance. She was always screaming at her, the landlady, and at her daughter and the visitors, calling them drunken pigs, and her daughter a pockmarked whore and a topless hussy. I spare you the rest of the rather creative swear words and allegations. Years later, we find the junk shop owner, Rebecca Juriaans from Emden, then 80 years old, imprisoned, accused of running a brothel in her home and storing stolen goods. Next one, please. Who else would Rembrandt have met when he stepped outside his door? His other direct neighbor was the celebrated portrait painter and appraiser Nicolaas Elias Piquenoy, who rented the house from its young owner, Nicolaas Pauw, the son of the nobleman and diplomat Adriaan Pauw. Piquenoy had moved in around 1637 when the art trader Uilenburg left for quarters further down the street. Piquenoy also bought the house because he sold it in 1645 to the Jewish tobacco merchant Daniel Pinto from Lisbon. Pinto, who first appears in Amsterdam archives around 1633, moved into the house with his wife Rachel and their 2-year-old Sarah. His son Moses was born there in 1647. Pinto rented space in Rembrandt's cellar to store his tobacco, which we know on account of a conflict between them in 1654. Like many buildings in the street, Pinto's house was sinking, forcing him to carry out a huge renovation. A year later, he had a notary draft a statement saying that Rembrandt had not paid him for his share of the cost for the renovation of the shared wall between their houses. 1 month later, Pinto supplemented his statement, complaining that the renovation kept him from using the rented cellar space for 5 to 6 months. This may have been an attempt to force Rembrandt to pay the cost after all, or an excuse for not paying the rent. Pinto died in 1681. We find his tombstone with carved flower wreaths and vases at the Oudekerk Jewish Cemetery, next to that of his son Moses. The same month, there was more trouble going on in Rembrandt's cellar. The brothers and tobacco merchants Jacob and Samuel Pereira, who also rented space in the cellar, discovered a theft. On February 10, the same notary took a deposition at the request of the Pereira brothers from the 19-year-old David Nunes. David said that he had lodged with a man named Eliezer Swaap, living in a cellar near the St. Anthony's Lock. There he saw a large batch of tobacco. It turned out that Swaap, together with his companion named Schweinglas, managed to steal about 60 rolls of tobacco from Pereira's storage space in Rembrandt's cellar. They worked at this over a period of 1.5 months in the very early morning, using a key to the back entrance given to them by an employee of the Pereiras, with Swaap's wife on the outlook. Next one, please. Looking into the owners and residents of the houses in the same block, we find a mix of people in terms of religious background and profession. For example, next to the houses owned by Rodriguez lived the clothes merchant and silk shop owner Joris Wouters in a house named the Witte Rooster. Other neighbors in the same row were Simon Lievens, a cobbler or shoe seller with his family, his son Lieve, a merchant in leather, who would later buy Rembrandt's house after the bankruptcy, together with the son of another resident of the block, the carillon player Harman Geerdings. Next one. The next house, the Zilveren Doornenkroon, the Silver Thorn Crown, was sold in 1644 by the Remonstrant minister Johan uit de Boogaard, known for Rembrandt's painted and etched portraits in the mid-1630s, as husband and guardian of Susanne van Eindhoven, who he had married the previous year. They lived, however, elsewhere. The new owner was the merchant Paulus van Fockenbroek, who moved into the house with his family. But his business didn't go well, and in connections with the financial difficulties, an inventory was drawn up in 1649. Like Rodriguez and Rembrandt, the Fockenbroeks sat on Spanish chairs the oak drawing table with Turkish carpet, and many paintings, including family portraits, some landscapes, and a Christ and Mary. In 1650, the property passed by a forced sale into the hands of a prominent member of the Jewish community, the Portuguese Jewish merchant, pepper trader, and shareholder of the West Indian Company, David Abendana. This native of Lisbon lived in the house with his wife Hannah Osorio, who was the daughter of merchant Bento Osorio, and their many children. The Abendanas too donated and deposited various ceremonial objects to the Portuguese synagogue, such as a Torah scroll with ivory holders, silver Torah finials, and textile coverings for the Torah. Other neighbors in the row were the heirs of Dirk Jansson Kompas, a compass maker, whose house was appropriately named the Crowned Compass. He seems not to live there, but to rent it out to the Jewish physician, Abraham Farquhar the Younger. Further, we find the Jewish merchant Manuel Mendes Franco. Next one. In the large double building in the row lived an extremely wealthy merchant from Bruges, Pieter Rans, with his wife Rebecca Karel. After their daughter Jacoba married in 1648 with the later mayor of Amsterdam, Gilles Valkenier, he moved in with her in her parental home. Next slide, please. If Rembrandt would have turned to the right into a small alley named Vlooienburgsteeg, he would have passed the house where the controversial philosopher Uriel da Costa lived before he ended his life in 1640. Having been the target of a long-term public smear campaign and having been expelled from the Jewish community, da Costa ended his life by shooting himself. The year before, he had transferred his possessions and the contents of his house to his maidservant, Dinha de Castro, stating to the notary that she'd been living with him and served him well, and that she kept him pleased. In his autobiography, which was reportedly found in his death house and published many years later, we read that the allegations had prevented him from a marriage he really wanted as a widower. He seems to have been living in common law with this Dinha, a situation in which Rembrandt would also end up with Hendrikje Stoffels many years later. If Rembrandt would have continued his walk, at the end of the alley, he would pass the house of someone he surely knew, the physician and scholar, Dr. Evruin. Oh, the former, please. Can you go one back? Yes. The physician and scholar, Dr. Efraim Ezekiel Bueno. His spacious home was on the corner of the Houtgracht, where the entrance was located. Bueno was a man with prominent contacts both within and outside the Jewish community. For example, we encounter him in a letter of 1646 from the poet Joost van de Vondel to his colleague P.C. Hooft. In this, Vondel amusingly recalls this now deceased friend, the Remonstrant City Secretary of Amsterdam, Daniel Mostard, had invited Bueno to go with him to the patient with the big belly and deemed it advisable to relieve the superfluous moisture that was bothering this patient. The patient turned out to be a wine barrel, which Bueno and Mostard helped to empty together. Thus Bueno was not only befriended with Mostard, but he was clearly also a good acquaintance of Vondel and Hooft. In Rembrandt's portrait of him, Bueno, on the right, Bueno is depicted standing, his hand resting on a banister in an interior, presumably his house. Bueno may have lived there long before he bought the house in 1652. His father, Joseph Bueno, also a famous physician, rented the house previously. We know this from quite a revealing source about their daily life. When the house next door was sold in 1641, it was stipulated that the Jewish doctor, and this can refer both to Joseph, who died that year, or Ephraim, was to be allowed to continue to use a shared secret, an outdoor toilet, with the neighbors. In 1650, the house is still rented by Bueno family. So when Rembrandt portrait Bueno in 1647, he probably lived right around the corner. Next one, please. If Rembrandt continued his walk and crossed the bridge to the city island of Vlooienburg, he would enter the Korte Houtstraat. There, at number 32, stood the house with the sign, the Temple of Solomon. This was the home of the well-known rabbi, teacher and scholar Jacob Judah Leon Templo. The latter addition to his name refers to his famous reconstructions of the temple. His house was actually the first Jewish museum in Amsterdam. It was a small museum in which he showed models of the temple and the tabernacle in the desert, as well as large replicas of the biblical golden menorah, the altar, the table with the showbreads, and the garments of the high priest. Visitors who came from far to see his creations could also purchase engravings with these objects, or copies of his book about the reconstruction of the temple. This book was very popular, as it was reprinted several times and eventually published in 5 languages. All of this Leon advertised in posters, including his poster. Can I have the next one? Including his portrait made by the Jewish engraver Salome Italia, of which you see here a very rare colored copy. In a letter, possibly to State Secretary Constantijn Huyns, Leon wrote that his model could be disassembled and therefore easily transported. Indeed, his temple model was shown at fairs in The Hague in Haarlem, possibly even at the court of the Prince of Orange, and later at the English court. From a letter by Constantijn Huygens, we know that around 1647 he had taken Hebrew lessons with Leon. A practice sheet has been preserved among Huygens' papers, showing the Hebrew alphabet, probably calligraphed by de Leon, and in Huygens' writing, the Dutch names and vocalization signs of the letters. The sheet is preceded by a note by Huygens with the address of his teacher near the Ballonbaan, the latter referring to a very popular handball court nearby. Turning back to the Breestraat, Catty Corner across the lock from Rembrandt and Saskia was the house where the celebrated artist and art buyer Pieter Isaacs had lived. After his death in 1625, the house was bought by the gunpowder producer Caspar van Collem and his wife Catharina Dubois. After the marriage in 1626 of their daughter Susanna to her cousin, the merchant Jan Pellicorn, the newlyweds may even have lived there for some time. They surely knew Rembrandt. About 1633, a portrait of Pellicorn with his son Caspar and a pendant of Susanna with their daughter Anna were painted in Rembrandt's studio. I have the next. Their next door neighbor from 1631 to 1638 was Rabbi Isaac Montalto, who served as an advisor to King Louis XIII of France. Montalto was an active man. In addition to his rabbinical duties and his role in publishing Jewish religious works to be printed by Manasseh ben Israel, he and his brother run a lucrative business in Zivetskets. He was confident enough to engage in disputes with Christians, as he is mentioned as a participant with Manasseh ben Israel, a certain named Rabbi Aaron, and Jacob Judah Leon, in a religious debate with the polemist Jan Pieterszoon Beeldhouwer. This schoolmaster and comforter of the sick was a controversial thinker who actively sought discussion with the rabbis in preparation for his book, Shield of the Christians Against All Non-Christians, published in 1649. The stated purpose of his book was to protect Christianity against its detractors, including Jews. At the beginning, he describes a conversation he had in 1644 with Montalto and Rabbi Aaron in the hearing of several Jews. Beeldhouwer says that it took place in Montalto's house, but we cannot be certain that it was the house in the Jode Breestraat, because he sold it in 1638 to a Catholic. Next one, please. The house next door to the rabbi belonged to an acquaintance of Rembrandt, the painter, art dealer, and appraiser Adriaan van Nieuwland, who owned it from 1614 to 1651. He and his wife Katelijne and their 9 children seem not to have lived permanently in the house op de Breestraat. Over the years, we come across them at different addresses in the city. And at some point, the house seems to have been rented to Reinier Jans, the owner of a silk shop. But when Katelijne died in 1645, they lived there, because Van Nieuwland gave us his address to the orphan chamber on the Breestraat, across the sluis from Rembrandt the painter. Next one. Next to it was the parental home of Johan Huidekoper, merchant, Lord of Marseille, director of the VOC, and 6-time burgomaster of Amsterdam, who in 1628 was the first documented purchaser of a painting by Rembrandt. In later years, the house was inhabited by the lawyer and alderman Jacob Franszoon Hindopen, who had married Huidekoper's daughter Maria. Incidentally, Rembrandt and Geertje Dirks appeared for Hindopen in 1649 in his position as commissioner of the marital dispute court. In 1654, he sold the house to the Jewish merchant Jacob de Pinto from Rotterdam, and who had married in Amsterdam with Rebecca, the daughter of another neighbor. Next one. His brother Isaac de Pinto is known as the builder and resident of the still existing stately Pinto house, further down the street. In an etching of the exterior made years later by the Dutch engraver Romein de Hooge, we see a man, which is probably de Pinto's son David, standing in front of the door, surrounded by a group of people, including beautifully dressed ladies with high wigs, presumably Sephardic ladies. Their appearance contrasts with that of the 2 men further down the street, one of whom has a beard and is wrapped in a long cloak. That is how the more traditional German Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, were depicted at the time. Thanks to a family history that Isaac penned down, we know a lot about Pinto. For example, so we talk about the father now. For example, we know that he married his cousin Rachel and that he was deeply in love with her, and that the couple wanted to move from Rotterdam to Amsterdam because they found Rotterdam depressing because of the lack of young people in their community. In 1652, however, shortly after giving birth to her first child, Rachel died, and the grieving widower had to leave his newborn son behind to supervise the construction of the house in the Breestraat. After making the move, he held various administrative positions at the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam. Succumbing to heavy pressure from his family, in 1654 he agreed to marry Rachel da Vega, an orphaned relative without a dowry, so that his son would have a mother to take care of him. Their marriage contract, signed by Rabbi Ben Israel, has been preserved. It is in the highly decorative style popular at the time. The colored frame has vignettes referring to marriage and biblical scenes, a testimony to the artistic taste of the Amsterdam Sephardim. It was designed by one of the few Jewish artists of that time, Salom Italia of Mantua, who lived and worked in Amsterdam in the 1640s. Next one, please. Italia was known especially for its very decorative Megillot, Esther scrolls, with triumphal arches, portraits of the protagonist of the Book of Esther, and narrative scenes with Dutch landscape in the background. Italia also made portraits of rabbis, Jacob Jude Leon, and, as you see here, Menashe ben Israel. Turning back to the block across the street from Rembrandt, the 5th house was the parental home of Frans Banning Kok, the later burgomaster of Amsterdam, lawyer and lord of the castle of Huis Ilpenstein, and captain in Rembrandt's night watch. It was sold in 1646 to the widow of Lieutenant Cornelis Michels Blauw, who lived there with her 2 daughters until her death. Next to her was a pharmacy, followed by the haars of the heirs of Govert Spruit, a coppercaster. His wife Treintje van Kokelen had previously been married to another well-known former resident of the street, the painter Jacques Saverij. Her son was the still-life painter Johannes Spruit. There were more notable people living on the block. The pharmacist Pieter van Teylingen, who served as a deacon and elder of the Reformed Church, Isaac Belmonte from Spain, a merchant and board member of the Portuguese Jewish community. Manasseh ben Israel dedicated his Hope of Israel to him in 1615, and in 1656, Belmonte signed the ban on philosopher Baruch de Spinoza. Further, we have Abraham Aboab Osorio from Lisbon, a wholesaler in Brazilian tobacco and silk, who held various administrative positions in the community. He was married to Sarah, a daughter of merchant Bento Osorio, who also lived in the Breestraat. Next one. Next slide, yes. Next door to the Aboab family lived one of the richest women of the Breestraat. Can I have the next slide? Elisabeth Bell, widow of Nicolaas van Bambeek, with her son Nicholas Jr., a trader in clothes and wool, and her daughter-in-law Agatha Bas, with their 6 children. In 1641, the year in which Rembrandt painted his Night Watch, he portrayed Nicolaas and Agatha. In 1649, they sold the house to the sugar merchant Abraham Pereira from Madrid, and he may have been the donor of an extremely valuable antique carpet, which on the occasion of the inauguration of the new Portuguese synagogue was transformed into a cover for the lectern from which the Torah is read, and which is still kept until today. Abraham and Sarah were the parents of the previously mentioned tobacco dealers, who also rented Rembrandt's cellar. Their son Isaac married to Rachel de Pinto. I think we've lost the PowerPoint, am I correct? Yes, 2 back, please. One more back. Okay, that's okay. Okay, no, one down is fine. Yes, please. Thank you, Leah. The last house in the row was a stately building called het Romeins Keizerhoofd, the Roman Emperor's head. This was the family home of the Osorios. Merchant Bento Osorio, a native of Lisbon, was one of the founders of the Sephardic Jewish community of Amsterdam. He was living in the Breestraat as early as 1627 in a house opposite the Zuiderkerk, when he bought a hoverinke, a homestead, and a watermill by Hans van Koningslo, and a copper crown from the estate of merchant and silk trader Hendrik Hoefslager, also a resident of the Breestraat. Osorio also owned a Torah scroll with painted handles and a deep red silk lining, which he deposited in the synagogue. When Osorio died in 1644, the large building remained the family residence. Next one, please. 2 more Jewish denizens of Rembrandt's neighborhood cannot be left unmentioned. They are well-known men whose different skills led to the creation of a beautiful manuscript. Rabbi Sol Levi Mortera and calligrapher Yehuda Maccabeu. The former, the rabbi, bought in 1650 for the considerable sum of 8,500 guilders the house on the corner on the other side of the lock where Rembrandt lived. Mortera had arrived in Amsterdam in 1616 when he accompanied the remains of Elia Montalto, the personal physician to the French queen, to his final resting place at the Jewish cemetery in Oudekerk. He served as rabbi in the Portuguese Jewish congregation, first in Bet Jacob, and after the unification of the congregations in 1639 in Talmud Torah. One of his duties as a rabbi was to encourage the practice of halachic Judaism among the Amsterdam-based descendants of Spanish and Portuguese conversos. This was no easy task, because many ex-conversos had left Christianity without completely returning to the Jewish law. In his sermons, he also expresses criticism about conversos still living as Catholics in their homelands, but also about the exuberant dress and banquets common among the wealthy Sephardim of his time, them living in large houses with empty rooms, while others had no place to live. He also made a name for himself for openly criticizing Christianity in his writings, especially Catholicism, but also the Calvinism of his day. And in 1556, It was also Mortera who pronounced the ban on Baruch de Spinoza from his seat in the rabbinical court. Last one. For years, this portrait of an old man by Rembrandt from about 1660 was associated with Mortera. The Jewish historian Jacques Schwartz had no doubt about this identification. In his article of 1929, he muses about a visit by Rembrandt to the rabbi to, I quote, ask the same master about the biblical difficulties resulting in this portrait. This is, however, very unlikely. The painting is dated 1665, and Mortera passed away in 1660. Can you go one back? Also calligrapher Judah Maccabeu. One slide back, please. Also the calligrapher Judah Maccabeu lived in a house at the Lock when he married in 1637 to the 24-year-old Blanca Cardoso. He left in 1646 for Brazil to return more than 10 years later. He was an outstanding calligrapher, the master of multitude of scripts. A collection of sheets, which you see in the middle, with proofs of his talent had been preserved. With this, his clients could choose the handwriting they wanted for their document. There was a lively market for his talent in the Portuguese Jewish community. Wealthy patrons ordered copies of manuscript, but we also come across framed Hebrew texts in estate inventories. It was Maccabeu who calligraphed 5 copies of a famous work from the aforementioned Rabbi Mortera shortly after his death. That this specific work continued to be circulated in volumes that had been copied by hand rather than printed was probably because of the provocative nature of the work that openly challenged Christian tenets. As a final remark, clearly Rembrandt's direct neighbors were very diverse in terms of profession and religious background. But when it comes to envisioning what the Jews of his corner of Amsterdam thought of Rembrandt, we are left in the same situation as David de Jong. Apart from notarial dispositions concerning altercations, we too are dependent on our imagination. But we cannot doubt that in his walks he met Jews and people of all kinds, and that at least some of them knew that he was a famous artist and will have spoken of or to him with respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirjam. That was a lovely walk, and we'll get back to a little later. Before going on to the next speaker, I'm happy to say that Sanchez has missed slides. Now, I think he's gone, but he excused himself. He had a commitment this evening to speak in London in connection with the Jewish Book Week. But in his previous PowerPoint, this is what I was able to recover for you. Here is the full-length, standing, full frontal nude that Lucien Freud painted of himself in self-portrait, holding his palette and brushes in his hand. But I have also recovered Simon's comments on this, in which he compares it with the Apollo Belvedere. Here we are. These are Simon's own words. 1993, the full-length nude reflection with its central focal point, the Freudian genitals, tendered in a knotted clot of pigment, might, I suppose, be seen as unsparing, an old pair of sandals protecting his feet from floor splinters, were it not for the fact that the artist is in fact rendering himself as a makeover of the Apollo Belvedere, either a fine professional in joke or else even by his standards, an act of defiant hubris. Okay, Simon will be able to enjoy this when he comes back and looks at the recording, which is going to go up after the sessions are over. Now, introducing Bart gives nachas of a special kind, because I first met him 11 years ago, sitting in his class for the Jewish Adult Education Institution Keskas, which I can recommend to all. Bart gave in Utrecht a spirited, impressively well-informed course on Jewish-Palestinian history of the 1940s. So it did not surprise me when in 2018, he was appointed assistant professor of political history at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and last year, full professor of Jewish studies at the University of Amsterdam. He has studied and published on an astonishing range of subjects, mainly in Dutch Jewish history, from Yiddish historiography, which was the subject of his dissertation, to the relation of the House of Orange to the Dutch Jewish community, and really a spectacular subject to treat. He can always be counted on for a sophisticated, complex take on whatever subject he investigates, and a clear way of telling and writing about it. We first asked Bart to talk about Hebrew knowledge and education in Leiden and Amsterdam, but we were delighted when he came back with a suggestion of his own, and that is to speak on a subject that has been nearly completely ignored in Rembrandt studies, but which hopefully has a lot to tell us. He is speaking about the Jews in Amsterdam's neighborhood, but not the Sephardim, to whom so much attention has been given, also in Mirjam's talk, but the increasingly numerous Ashkenazi of Amsterdam. Thank you, Bart.
Thank you so much, Gary, for your introduction, and it's such an honor to be here. So thanks to you and to Mirjam and to the museum. Yeah, indeed, I love to present the Jews I'd like to call Rembrandt's other Jews, the Amsterdam Ashkenazim. Now, I think Leah is going to share my presentation. So maybe yeah, there she is. Great. So when Rembrandt settled in 1631 in the vibrant eastern neighborhoods of Amsterdam known as Vlooienburg and Uilenburg, he found himself in a truly cosmopolitan environment. All sorts of languages could be heard in the streets. People hailed from different parts of the world and adhered to a variety of religions. Among these neighbors, Rembrandt also encountered Jews, as we just heard in the great presentation by Mirjam. Most of them were Portuguese Jews, referring to the Iberian Peninsula they had left as new Christian international tradesmen. In Amsterdam, in a complicated and challenging process, they reinvented themselves as new Jews. Some of them established working relationships with Rembrandt, and he is known to have painted one of their medical doctors, Ephraim Bueno. Well, the Portuguese Jewish community, composed of some 1,000 people at the time, has attracted a lot of attention in Rembrandt scholarship and Jewish historical studies alike. There was one more Jewish community. In the shadows of the successful Portuguese community, slowly but steadily, another Jewish community was established, an Ashkenazi one. These Jewish immigrants from the German and Central European territories only appear anonymous in Rembrandt's oeuvre, but they made up part of his cultural imagination no less than the Portuguese Jews. I would therefore like to call them Rembrandt's other Jews and aim to bring to the light the dynamics of Amsterdam's second Jewish community, which within a century's time developed into the largest one in all of Europe. Let's go to the next slide. founding of a second Jewish community in Amsterdam was a process that took the established Portuguese community and with the municipal authorities. In the course of the century, I will argue, the Amsterdam Ashkenazi community developed a profile of its own, deeply interwoven with the social fabric of the metropole. Now, I will address tonight three related topics. First, border making between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Second, structuring the Ashkenazi community, and fighting communal challenges. The first half of the 17th century is a formative period for both Jewish communities, the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi ones. In heavily intertwined processes, they defined their identities and negotiated the borders between the two. This process, however, was conditioned by asymmetrical power relations, with the Portuguese community having the upper hand. In order to grasp what happened to the Ashkenazim, we have to start briefly with the Portuguese. Theirs was a community composed for a large part out of new Jews, who in a climate of religious mobility had opted to adopt the religion of their ancestors. They became Jews, but were well aware of their singular identity. Two major elements played a huge role in defining their identity: ethnicity and religion. First, ethnicity. Since they cherished their Iberian heritage, and most of them were not refugees in the proper sense of the word, but first and foremost members of a diasporic community united by links with the country and culture of origin. Ethnic solidarity was expressed by using the term nação, which was supposed to comprise all descendants of the 1942 Spanish Jews, wherever they lived, and irrespective of religion was key to their identity. They were Jews by choice, at least the dedicated core of the community was. Also in Amsterdam, there were many Portuguese immigrants who hesitated to make a choice and preferred to keep their options open for as long as possible. Now, religion and ethnicity were partly overlapping circles. Part of the nação was Jewish, another part of the nação was Catholic or even Protestant. There was, however, one more problem. In cities such as Amsterdam, Venice, and Hamburg, the new Jews also encountered old Jews with different ethnicities, among them Italian Jews, Tedescos, and Polacos, German and Polish Jews. Within the Amsterdam Portuguese community, defining the borders with the new Christian family members on the Iberian Peninsula, in the New World and in the various port cities, was one of the major questions. The other being negotiating the borders with Jews of various backgrounds in Amsterdam. Non-Sephardic Jews challenged and complicated the already highly complex search for establishing a collective identity among the Amsterdam New Jews. Not long after the Portuguese started a merchant community in Amsterdam, Ashkenazim settled there as well. Among them is the famous Uri Halevi family from Emden that played such an important role in the mythology on the founding of the Sephardic community. These Ashkenazim are portrayed as the first to initiate the new Christians in Judaism proper. Next, other Ashkenazim arrive in the city as well. They were part of a much larger pattern of migration from the Germanic Lutheran minority community of a comparable size to the Jewish ones. Ashkenazim were pushed out of the Holy Roman Empire due to the ongoing wars and economic conditions and limited possibilities for Jews to settle and start families. Amsterdam, on the other hand, was a bustling metropolis in nearest Ashkenazim in the city hail from places such as Hamburg, Frankfurt am Main, Hanau, Worms, Beckhoven, and Prague. Most of them are very poor, working as servants in the Sephardic households, as kosher butchers for the Portuguese, in petty trades with the Germanic countries, and as peddlers and beggars. Now, one of the questions that needed to be answered, and I'd like to have the next slide, please, was what status the Ashkenazim would get. On the one hand, they shared the religion with the Sephardim. On the other hand, they were not part of the Nassau. In the early modern period, there were various models to structure Jewish communities. The first one is the Levantine model, which was followed in cities such as Venice, Salonika, and Constantinople. Here, different Jewish communities were established, reflecting the practices and grouped by kinship of the city or region of origin. This resulted in myriad synagogues and communities, also including ones rooted in Hungary, Germany, and Poland. The second model is the Colonial Model, where another strategy was followed, which was no less within halachic practices. Here, the first Jews arriving established the Nusach and the Minhag of the communities, whereas others who arrived later had to conform. In the colonial context of the Dutch and British Americas, this meant that Sephardim established the communities, in which, in most instances, with the notable exception of Suriname, Ashkenazim were integrated. Until the first half of the 19th century, most Jewish communities in the Americas were Sephardic, although a significant part of the membership was ethnically Ashkenazi. Amsterdam, in the end, fitted into the West European model, with two large Jewish communities defined on the basis of the Sephardic and Ashkenazi halacha and nusach. And the next slide, please. This was the outcome of a process taking several decades, which the printing revolution resulted in the rapid spread of halachic codices and prayer books throughout Europe. This led, on the one hand, to cultural transfer between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi domains, but also to new border making. The huge success of Rabbi Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch, a predominantly Sephardic codification of halakha, of Jewish law, resulted in Ashkenazi mobilization, as Joseph Davis has demonstrated. Rabbi Moses Isserles wrote glosses to the Shulchan Aruch on each occasion where Ashkenazi halachot differed from the Sephardic ones. And these glosses are titled, so this process of codification of the halakha and of establishing the borders between both major halachic traditions intersected with the process of negotiating the differences between various types of Jews in Amsterdam. Initially, Amsterdam housed 3 Sephardic communities, in which most non-Sephardic Jews were not admitted as full members, but were allowed to be in its orbit. They had a position in the margins, and as such were integrated in the religious infrastructure, serving in the kosher sector, albeit on a different plot. Amsterdam could have opted for either the Levantine or Colonial Model, but instead ended up forming two different Jewish communities, each adhering to one of the dominant halachic traditions. The simplified halachic landscape created by Caro and Isserles was retranslated into the map of Jewish Amsterdam. Simultaneously, the three different Portuguese communities went into a process of unification, resulting in one Sephardic community, Talmud Torah, while the Ashkenazim were pushed out of the Sephardic communities. It's therefore no coincidence that 1639 is both the year of the start of the unified Ashkenazi community and of the distinct Ashkenazi communities in Rosh Hashanah 1635. Steadily, they processed from a private minyan to renting a room for synagogue services in 1636 to forming an autonomous Ashkenazi community in 1639. Even then, it took until 1642, after significant pressure from the Portuguese, that they opened their own cemetery in Muidenberg. At that time, they also rented a large building from the Sephardim to serve as their synagogue, before acquiring a large new synagogue at Houtgracht in 1649. Whereas the religious borders were now clearly marked, and religious spaces were mostly disentangled, in the neighborhood, Sephardim and Ashkenazim still shared the same space, together with Rembrandt and many other non-Jews. To no avail, the Mahamat, the leadership of the Portuguese community, ordered the Portuguese to no longer give alms to Ashkenazi schnorrers and beggars who assembled at the gate of the Sephardic synagogue on Fridays and Jewish holidays. They, thus the Mahamat, showed vices contrary to the morals and spirit of Bom Judaismo, the good, the civilized Judaism developed by the Amsterdam Sephardim. The Ashkenazim were definitely in need of re-education and a civilizing offense. And the Portuguese were even willing to contribute to this, but only on the condition that they formed a distinct community. Next slide, please.
Bart, can I use the opportunity and ask you to switch off maybe?
The Ashkenazi.
Switch off your video because the sound is not very good, and maybe without video it will be better.
I'll do right away. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. The Ashkenazi community grew from some 500 members in 1640 to 2,500 in 1670. Initially, the community demonstrated traits common throughout the Ashkenazi diaspora. But gradually, the local context of the city of Amsterdam and the constant interplay with the Sephardic community resulted in an Ashkenazi community that closely mirrored the early modern Amsterdam. And I will discuss two features. First, the governance of the community, and second, its membership policies. At the start, the Amsterdam Ashkenazi community is quite egalitarian. The founding members share humble origins and Ashkenazi traditions. They structure the community they found relatively close to medieval Ashkenazi patterns. There's a board of memunim, later called panasim, and there are religious functionaries. The borders between lay leadership and religious leadership are not clearly defined, and functions could be combined. Someone could act simultaneously as a chazan and a panas, or serve in other leadership roles. Several of the memonim also function as rabbi, in a fashion that was quite common in medieval Ashkenaz, but became rare in the early modern period. The differentiation of both roles also gradually evolved in the Amsterdam Ashkenazi community, ultimately leading to clearly defined responsibilities for lay leaders and religious leaders. This gradual process of differentiating leadership roles coincided with other changes. Initially, the election procedure was quite democratic, with all members being able to vote for the memonim. This did not prevent frequent leadership struggles within the community, often intersected with debates on the halachic and liturgical identity of the community. As the founding members hailed from different Ashkenazi communities, they brought with them a variety of minhagim, customs, and traditions. Only in the course of time, the Amsterdam minhagim established themselves. In 1648 and 1656, measures were taken to restrict the election procedure to a select number of prominent regulations. The structure of the Ashkenazi community in the end closely resembled the oligarchic governance of the city of Amsterdam. Just as the city was led by a team of burgomasters with monthly rotating presidency, the Kehillah was led by a team of panasim with monthly rotating presidency. Whereas initially there was ample room for social mobility, in the end it's a small number of wealthy families that controlled the affairs of the community. The procedures of electing new burgomasters and new panasim also closely resembled each other. Membership policies witness the same development. In the early decades of the community, all newcomers were welcomed and accepted as full members. Together, the members invested in the community institutions, the synagogues, the meat hall, the cemetery, and the mikvah. They all had equal access to all services and were granted mitzvot in the synagogue service. This, however, changed over time and resulted in a new structure of membership that was closely aligned to that of the Portuguese community and to the city of Amsterdam. In the Portuguese community, a membership policy was crafted that differentiated members according to their ethnicity. Only fully Sephardic Jews could be accepted as yechidim, full members. These enjoyed full political rights within the community, could have a seat in the synagogue, and enjoyed mitzvot. A second category was created for Jews of different origins, such as the Italian Jews. They were called congregantes. Until the founding of the Ashkenazi Kehillah in 1639, Ashkenazim could not become either yechidim or congregantes, but were foreigners who had a position in the margins of the community. Now, the Ashkenazi Kehillah took over this layered model of membership policies, but instead of ethnicity, another criterion is developed. The policies of the city of Amsterdam are taken as an example. The city differentiated between the porters, defined as the established Amsterdam inhabitants, whose ancestors had built up the city and its institutions, and they therefore were entitled to its profits and use. Wealthy newcomers could buy themselves the status of porter and acquire the same position. Next, there were the inhabitants, who were allowed to live in the city, but without political rights and access to the municipal services, such as the local orphanage. And finally, there were the migrant communities, organized as nations, who were expected to be fully self-sufficient. In the Ashkenazi community, something much alike developed. There were the yechidim, the full members. These were the founding members and their offspring, newcomers could buy themselves in, but in the course of time, it became more and more expensive to do so. It is estimated that in the 18th century, only some 20% of the entire Jewish population was a full member. The second category were the Toshavim, actually the largest group in the community. They were allowed to live in Amsterdam and to contribute to the Ashkenazi community, but did not have political rights, could not hire a seat in the synagogue, did not get mitzvot, and from 1740 onwards would not be buried at Muidenberg cemetery, but rather at their own cemetery at Zeeburg. The last was also the case for the Orachim, the foreigners who ended up in Amsterdam. So both in governance and in membership policies, the Ashkenazi community thus mimicked the city at large. From Ashkenazim in Amsterdam, they developed in Amsterdam Ashkenazim, with their own customs, structure, and identity. Next slide, please. In the period Rembrandt lived in Amsterdam, first around Vlooienburg, later at the Rozengracht, the Ashkenazi Kehillah faced two major challenges, threatening the internal stability tension. The first one is the arrival of a new group of immigrants from the 1650s onward. They came from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a result of the war with Russia and the invasion of Sweden. They established their own minyan, their own prayer services in Amsterdam, according to the Litvak traditions, although they were called Polakos. To the dismay of the existing Ashkenazi Kehillah, the Portuguese supported the new immigrants in founding an independent third Jewish community, the Polish one. In 1660, the municipal authorities formally accepted this third Amsterdam Jewish nation. The new immigrants differed from the existing High German Jews in their customs, the pronunciation of Yiddish, and the tradition of learning. Whereas most High German Jews were raised within the Western Ashkenazi traditions of studying Torah and Talmud, the East European Jews had developed new, sophisticated methods of studying Talmud, called Pilpul. Their learning was highly appreciated by the Amsterdam Sephardim and also useful for the further development of the Jewish printing industry, which acquired a dominant position within the Sephardic and Ashkenazi diasporas. It's only in 1673 that the municipal authorities forced the Polish Jews to give up their community and join the Ashkenazi one. The second major challenge is constituted by the Sabbatean movement. It is well known that the Amsterdam Sephardim overwhelmingly believed in Shabtai Tzvi, who proclaimed himself to be the Messiah in 1665. The Amsterdam Ashkenazim, no less, were enthused by the proclamation of Shabtai Tzvi and even prided themselves that the Messiah's Ashkenazi wife, Sarah, had lived for a while in Amsterdam. Her brother was still living in the city and later received the nickname Shmuel Mashiach. When in 1666 the news broke that the Messiah had converted to Islam, the deception was huge. A significant part of Amsterdam Jewry, however, believed that Shabtai Tzvi's conversion of Islam and finally proclaimed the Messianic age. Among them were the Ashkenazi Parnasim, who in 1667 received a Sabbatean prophet, Shabtai Raphael, with all honors, and even coerced their rabbi, Rabbi Isaac Deckingen, to host the prophet in his house. As late as the turn of the century, the Shamash, the warden and secretary of the Ashkenazi community, Leiber Neuser, confessed to have been a secret believer in Shabtai Tzvi for decades. He was part of a secret society in Amsterdam that was in contact with other crypto-Sabbatean circles and that kept the Messianic fire alive. It was only now that he realized to have been misled. He composed a history book and evaluation of the Sabbatean movement to warn his offspring not to participate in such messianic movements in the future. Final slide, please. During Rembrandt's lifetime, in the neighborhood he spent most of his Amsterdam years, a second Jewish community established itself, markedly different from the prominent Sephardic one, no less colorful, however, adding High German and Polish-Lithuanian Ashkenazi traditions to the multicultural setting of early modern Amsterdam. Whereas initially this community fitted the mold of the Ashkenazi diaspora, gradually the community was woven into the fabric of Amsterdam society. When in the 18th century the Ashkenazi community developed into the largest one of Europe, the city counted no less than 23,000 Ashkenazi and some 5,000 Sephardim. The demographic balance between both communities had changed forever. Over the course of the 18th century, the power relations changed between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazi, and between the Ashkenazi community and the municipal authorities. Both within and without, borders needed to be renegotiated, and a new balance of power had to be struck. The position of the Amsterdam community within the much wider network of the Ashkenazi diaspora added much to its new status. Thank you.
Well, Bart, that was just wonderful. A lot of it was totally new to me and absolutely fascinating. I have to tell you that the bandwidth of your connection was defective, so that a lot of spots in your talk fell away.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear.
I'm going to recommend to the museum, and I think they'll agree with this, that we ask you to record it again in perfect conditions, and that we will put that up on the website along with the live recordings of the other talks.
Excellent.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
Of course.
Well, now we have a number of other participants who are speakers from other sessions. And along with Bart and Mirjam, I'll introduce to you. I see that Simon is still on board here in principle, but also we have Roman Grigoriev from the Hermitage, Larry Silver from the University of Pennsylvania, Stephen Nadler from the University of Wisconsin, and let's see, Shelley Perloff was here too. I don't see her right now. And the discussion is now open to all of us concerning the three talks that we've heard. Simon, are you still there? No, he's on screen, but he excused himself, and I don't think he's with us. Well, have you been unmuted? Yes, you have. I see. Steve's been unmuted. Mirjam has to unmute herself. Roman also. Larry, you have to leave in a few minutes, so you take the first. You pose the first question.
Well, it's a question for Sir Simon, and it's partly because he focused so beautifully on Bromberg that he didn't talk about what I thought was the most influential English painter who emulated Rembrandt in so many ways and wrote so eloquently about him, and that's Kitaj, who did one image of that he called the Jewish Rider, which is whose pose is derived from the Polish writer in the Frick Museum, and who made a number of images both about Jewish figures, but also images that allude to the aftermath of the Holocaust. And of course, Bromberg really didn't. I mean, he was around when the revelations of the wartime atrocities took public consciousness, but nevertheless, Kitaj is much more engaged with that. And I left Kitaj out of my paper because he's English, and also there are limits to what one can do in a single paper anyway. but I wanted
Mirjam
to
would
raise
have-
that.
Yeah, Mirjam would have been in the best position because she's done an exhibition on him and has been involved in Kitaj studies deeply. Mirjam?
Yes, he. I think I even sent you a list, Gary, long ago when we started with all the remarks that Kitaj actually made about Rembrandt and the connection he felt to Rembrandt. So Larry, you're very right. Kitaj, well, in the exhibition definitely, we seek to.
So we tried to borrow the most delicious Kitaj references to Rembrandt, like the Jewish writer and this self-portrait, and we're not getting them, I'm afraid, but we'll have work by him. And in any case, in the catalog, and we'll be illustrating it. And he's now yours. If you can do 5 minutes on him in your talk, Larry, we'd be very happy.
I'll see if I can squeeze him in. Thanks.
Yeah, you're very right, Larry.
Yeah, Steve put up his hand.
Yeah, thanks. I have Mirjam. That was a wonderful presentation, really informative. And I have a question for you. I also posted in the chat. So we know that Manasseh ben Israel was not Rembrandt's neighbor on the Breestraat, as so many people have often claimed, but he lived on the Nieuwe Houtmarkt. But I've not been able to figure out where the Nieuwe Houtmarkt is, except maybe suspect that it's on the Vlooienburg Island, but I'm not quite sure which street it is.
It is. It's a very wide way of. I mean, that's the trouble. When people were living on Vlooienburg, they're mentioned in the archival records as living on Vlooienburg and the Houtmarkt, which is like major area. There are, however, reasons to think that he actually lived with his brother-in-law, Jona Brabanel, and then we have an exact address, Zwanenburgerwal 51, if I'm correct. I didn't include it in the talk today, but in the article I will include why we think that he probably lived in quite a big house, actually, with Jona Brabanel, who was well-to-do. The children intermarried as well, so that's one of the hypotheses right now. But he definitely didn't. I think people have confused Mortera with Manasseh. So there was a rabbi living there,
right.
Two actually, but not Manasseh.
So do you think then that he had his printing business on the Nieuwe Houtmarkt, but lived with
Yes.
Jonas Brabanel?
But I don't. Until now, it seems a bit like that he maybe lived in the house with Brabanel, and that he had a separate printing house. But I haven't been able to find the printing house yet, or
right.
ever.
All right. Well, thank you.
I was already so pleased when I found we found a note about Bueno in the toilet, so we could locate Bueno.
Right.
Michael, do you have anything to ask the speakers?
I do, and I just wanted to thank everyone because I think the talks have been terrific. And I had a question, I guess, for both Mirjam and Bart. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. The question is addressed to both of these talks that are level or in terms of our understanding of the Sephardim and Ashkenazim in the neighborhood, obviously, in which Rembrandt lived. So there have been recent revelations also about the presence of a small free Black African community in the vicinity of the Jodenbreestraat as well. And that's something I'm going to address when I speak next week. But I'm curious, Mirjam and Bart, what have you found, if anything, that might be new about the interactions between the Jewish communities and these Black Africans who live in the area? Because many did come originally as servants and slaves, this pardon. And then also, I think Bart mentioned that Ashkenazim are actually and Sephardic households as well. So I was curious if anything you've discovered or can shed light on.
And I can give a few remarks. Of course, today I couldn't present. I mean, what I present today was just a small bit of our research, but indeed, there were quite a few people, formerly enslaved people, living there. That, of course, slavery was forbidden in Amsterdam, so they were released. But released sometimes meant that they kept basically staying with Sephardi families and served them as housemates and part of the household. Some of them became Jewish, even, other not. We did find material we found records as well, that because this group that lived in the Breestraat, actually, in the start of the Breestraat, there were also trouble with former Sephardic families they have been acquainted with. So we do meet them. We have names. Sometimes they marry also, so then we know where they came from. And also there seem quite a few sailors. Yeah. So not only domestic servants, but so the ones. But of course, Mark de Ponte did most of the research on it, and I think he found most of the sources to be found. We haven't found a lot of new material.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
Sometimes we can locate it a bit more.
Of course, one of the things that's worth remembering when we talk about the servants, especially of the Sephardim, is that Christians were forbidden to work for Jews. So it would probably only be the early immigrants, the impoverished Ashkenazim, or these black servants who were brought over with the Portuguese Jews who were able to serve in a domestic role within Jewish households.
Very good point. Yeah, Bart, did you want to say anything in answer to the question?
Yeah.
Michael's question.
I think it's to the question of servants. Oh, Shelley?
I'm sorry. I lost my video, but I am still here. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Okay, we'll give you the floor in a second. Go ahead, Bart.
Definitely the domain of servants was a shared domain of Ashkenazim and black people, both black Jews and black non-Jews as well. And I think this fits very well into like all these groups are located in the margins of these communities, and they are treated as well likewise. They all end up in the same plot of Ouderkerk, for instance. They're all the problematic people in the orbit of the community, but not members of the community. And it's also a group, of course, for which a solution has to be found. And for the Ashkenazim, the solution in the end is to force them to found their own community. And for the black community, in the end, of course, there is also no structural place within the Sephardic community. And
you can read the Israeli daily papers to get the latest on this development with the problems in defining what makes a black Jew. Anyway, Shelley, what did you want to ask?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out a few things. I think the issue of conversion of the blacks who were brought over as, servants, largely from the colonies, the Muhammad had issued prohibitions against these blacks converting to, or any Christians converting to Judaism. But Mirjam is quite right that many did. But then they were, in terms of the Ouderkerk, they were buried, the Creoles were buried on the precincts. There was only a case of one person who was a very loyal and beloved servant who was actually buried right there with the founders, those large monuments in the center of the Oude Kerk. So this obviously, there were lots of issues. I mean, Mirjam is absolutely right regarding the blacks.
Wouldn't it be wonderful to discover that Rembrandt's great painting of two blacks in the Barrett's house is of black Jews? Who is going to find that out? Let's set Belmonte on the case. Listen, we're running very late right now. We're going to have a chance, another 3 sessions to talk to each other in front of the audience. But right now, I'd like to turn to the chats if there are questions from the audience at large rather than the panelists. Leah, do we have any chat questions?
There are just a lot of amazing messages thanking all the speakers for their just superb talks. And there is just one small question to Mirjam. What about all these houses now? Do they still stay there?
Actually, that's very sad. From the Breestaat, from the previous houses, there's actually the Pinta house, which I showed, and the Rembrandt house. Most of the other houses have been torn down, and that's what also makes this research not easy, because we really have to do it. We have to reconstruct everything with historical maps and counting houses and comparing that. So, for example, the house numbers I use are from 1876. Because after the whole area has been destroyed.
Thank you so much. That was the only question. Other questions are from the panelists that have already been said.
Good. Well, then we'll take leave of our audience, thanking all of you very much for staying with us and hoping to see you back for the next 3 weeks and as much time as you can to devote to this. And repeating, too, that if you're going to miss a session, you can always catch up on it in the recording that's going to be put up on the website of the Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center, and also on my website, the Schwartz list, as soon as they become available. And now we'll thank you and sign off, and hope to see you next week.
I lost my video.